Welcome to the Advance EU-EUA podcast series. What does it really take to make EU enlargement work for everyone? Europe is at a turning point, and the decisions made today about enlargement, integration, and Ukraine's path to the EU will shape the continent for generations. I am Inna Melnikovska, coordinator of the Advance EU-EUA Jean Monnet module, and I'm here with my co-host, Marta Beska, a young Ukrainian scholar who brings both lived experience and fresh academic thinking to everything we discuss. In this podcast series, we talk to leading researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to ask the questions that matter. How can EU enlargement be a win-win for Ukraine, for the EU, and for Europe as a whole? What can past enlargements teach us? And how do we turn lessons learned into real policy action? This is a space for honest, critical, and forward-looking conversation, because Europe's future is being written right now, and we think it's worth talking about. Welcome to Advance EU-EUA.
My name is Marta Beska. I am a scholar and an expert on EU integration. And as a Ukrainian, watching my country fight for its European future, I know how much these conversations matter. Our first episode is dedicated to the 2026 edition of Munich Security Conference, the leading international security forum which took place last week in Munich. With our distinguished guests, Erik Jones and Veronica Anghel, we will discuss the key takeaways from the conference and their implications for transatlantic relations, EU security and defense policy, and of course, Ukraine's accession to the European Union. We would like to welcome our first speaker, Erik Jones, Director and Professor of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. Welcome, Erik. Thank you very much for being with us today and to reflect on the implications of this major event, setting up the agenda of international security and defense policies. Please, Erik, tell us, what were your expectations from the conference, and are you satisfied with the outcomes? Can you say that they were positive for Ukraine?
Well, I think we have to separate two different things, right? One, the Munich Security Conference is a great meeting point for policymakers to come from all over Europe and North America, and indeed other parts of the world, to have a frank exchange about the issues that concern them most. There are some other security experts who join in the conversation. There's a lot of information that's exchanged. And it's an educational process for many of the more junior politicians who show up to try to figure out how things work in this international relations environment. So, for example, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez came to her first Munich Security Conference. Arguably, she did not do very well, but nevertheless, it was an important educational experience for her and an important part of her career development. So, in that sense, the meeting was a success. If you're going to look at the high level politics that comes out of these big speeches that take place at Munich, the Munich Security Conference was better than it was last year. And so in that sense, you could say, well, I mean, it wasn't awful, but what did we actually learn from the conference? I think we learned three things. First, the United States is not going to support Ukraine strongly in its defense against this unlawful and uninvited onslaught of Russian forces, right? So the war that we've been watching for the past 4 years is going to continue, but without active U.S. participation. The second thing that we learned is that the United States politically, or at least this administration, is not a big fan of the European Union and is indeed much more attractive to those forces, political forces in Europe that are anti-EU. And I think that that's a worry. And the third thing that we've learned is that while Europeans want as much as they can to avoid having an open conflict with the United States, they are slowly but surely getting the message that the transatlantic relationship is fundamentally changed. I think that in terms of Ukraine is the most important outcome. Because once the Europeans realize they have no one else but themselves to rely on in supporting Ukraine in this war, I think they'll step up their efforts significantly, and they have.
Thank you, Erik. And with enlargement on the table and ongoing debates about EU strategic autonomy, did the Munich Security Conference suggest that Europe is truly adjusting to long-term geopolitical shifts, or did you feel something important was actually missing there?
I mean, nobody was really talking about enlargement at the top level of the Munich Security Conference. But I think a lot of people were interested in the reporting that came out of Politico on Tuesday of last week, so before Munich, that the European Union actually has a response to the inclusion of Ukraine's accession to the European Union in the 20-point peace plan by the United States in this talk that's ongoing between the United States and Russia over Ukraine's future, right? So I think people were curious to hear how Europe would respond to the pressure now being put on a very accelerated enlargement, which would overturn completely the procedures for accession that had been established in the 1990s and early 2000s, right? So it came up in that sense. But the more fundamental question you're asking is, did Europeans talk about a serious and coherent strategy for using enlargement as part of the defense of Ukraine? I don't think they're quite there yet. I think there's still an ongoing conversation in the European Union about whether bringing Ukraine into the EU would enhance Ukraine's security and the European Union security, or whether it would detract from the security of both countries, right? Both Ukraine as a country and the European Union as a compound political entity. That debate needs to come to a sharper conclusion, and I suspect that will happen between now in March or now in June at the latest.
As you already mentioned, during the conference, we could observe quite visible differences between Brussels and Washington in how they interpret today's global challenges and how to address them. In your view, might this divergence affect Western support for Ukraine in general? And what should the EU do to ensure that it's not left alone carrying the burden sustaining this support?
I think the EU is alone carrying the burden, right? But I don't think it's such a burden in the sense that it's some unwanted lift that who put this burden on the EU? It wasn't the United States, it was Russia, right? The United States has decided not to carry its share of the burden, but the burden was on the EU the moment that Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And in the European Union is waking up to that reality. Certainly, if you listen to the new commissioner for defense and space, Andris Kubilius, he's quite explicit in the need for Europe to be able to push back against this Russian aggression. If you listen to Kaja Kallas, who's the High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, she's quite explicit as well. And if you listen to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she's been consistent in arguing that Europe needs to push back. So I think everybody has pretty much agreed that this is going to have to happen. And I don't think that anyone believes that a bad outcome in peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, if they ever become solely between Ukraine and Russia, would be a good result for the European Union. So I think there's a lot of interest at the European level, both to support Ukraine in its security and to support Ukraine in the search for a lasting and credible peace.
And in your opinion, is Europe truly ready in political, economic, military terms to sustain Ukraine and its battle for European security in its own?
Well, Marta, I think that's such a great question because I don't think it's almost like having your first child, right? Nobody is ready, right? I don't think Ukraine was ready to be invaded by Russia. I don't think the European Union was ready to see Ukraine suffer this invasion. I don't think the European Union is ready to take on the full burden, as we call it, right? And I'm not sure it is a burden to protect its security interests by reinforcing Ukraine absolutely as much as it can. It's not ready, but that doesn't matter. You don't have to be ready to get the job done. You just have to get the job done. And that's what they're going to try to accomplish.
Yeah, let's say not a burden, but rather the responsibility.
I agree, because the language of burden and burden sharing is entirely misplaced in that conversation.
Thank you. During the conference, a Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski noted that Europe's role in this war will determine whether it is a table or on the table in the New World Order. And looking at the EU from within, how realistic is the scenario for Europe to take a decisive strategic role in shaping this new world order? And do you think Europe is on the right track right now in developing its internal political, economic, and military capacity to sustain support for Ukraine and to respond to these long-term security challenges that we have on its own?
I think I think Sikorsky is great with a turn of phrase, and that comment about being at the table or on the table just proves that there's a cliche for every situation. The reality is that the European Union will eventually have to learn to assert itself, or it will not hold together. And that reality is stark. And the European Union is busy trying to figure out what it means to be able to assert itself and how it needs to equip itself to achieve that objective. That's what the whole debate about open strategic autonomy or strategic autonomy is all about. Can the European Union act decisively and with purpose? Obviously, these are learned skills. These are not things that political organizations are born with. And the European Union is learning, and it will continue to learn. The question is whether the European Union is going to acquire these skills quickly enough to ensure a successful outcome in Ukraine's defense of its own territory and its political integrity, right? And that's a question that I think worries all of us, including the top policymakers at the European level, and I'm sure the top policymakers and politicians in Ukraine, because time is not working to our advantage. The European Union does not have a lot of time to learn by doing. And it seems as though it's on the right track in terms of the many different policies and instruments and reports and blah, blah, blah that it's put in place. But the proof is in the pudding, right? And so we have to see the extent to which Europe succeeds in this venture. And there, I think Sikorsky is right. If Europe does not succeed, then it will have a lot of recovery to do after the fact. It's not going to become the menu for the meal, but it will have a lot of heavy lifting because its security situation will be significantly worsened, its political cohesion will be significantly damaged, and its institutions will be found wanting when they're needed most. So I think they need to get their act together now, and I think most European policymakers and politicians accept that reality.
So Europe definitely needs to speed up this process as quickly as possible.
But if you think about it, Marta, I mean, before Munich last year, Europeans were living in a comfortable delusion, right? And now not so much. So I think in a year they've done a lot. But then again, the pace of events is much faster than that. I mean, Ukraine had less than a week to survive its full-scale invasion, and Ukraine learned how to do that. So if Ukraine can accelerate the pace of education, self-awareness, to that degree, I think the European Union has a lot more to accomplish.
Indeed. Thank you, Erik. And which gaps in current European action do you see as crucial for long-term European security, prosperity, and the credibility of the EU commitments as a whole?
So, Marta, I think that's another excellent question, because the long term is often made up of a series of short terms, right? And yes, I think, if we imagine a long-term vision of Europe, a 30-year time horizon, there are a lot of things that we know need to happen. It needs to harmonize its defense industries, coordinate its military procurement, increase its investment, both in security, in terms of kinetic force, but also in the dual use infrastructure necessary to tie the continent together. It needs to build a real political community and develop a strategic culture. We could all list all the things that need to change over the next 30 years. The issue is, how is Europe going to get to those 30 years if it doesn't figure out how to help Ukraine get through this winter, right? And so I think there's a lot that needs to be done in order to bolster Ukraine's air defense mechanisms, to strengthen Ukraine's energy infrastructure, to provide the kind of military equipment that the Ukrainian armed forces need. And that includes munitions, but it also includes, all kinds of other things, right? And and the European Union is pivoting to do that. Whether it will do that quickly enough remains to be seen, but that's what has to happen. The support needs to arrive, and it needs to arrive quickly.
Thank you, Erik. Considering the EU-US Ukraine prosperity plan, you briefly mentioned it already before, which envisions Ukraine accession to the EU by the end of 2027 under this type of reverse enlargement logic, which enables accession without necessarily fulfilling all the required reforms at once. Do you think this approach can work for reform in Ukraine, and would it be possible for the EU to take such a responsibility on its shoulders, and or it would rather stick to the old gold merit-based process?
So, two things. The EU never really had a merit-based process for accession. And the notion of merit is so bureaucratic that it's almost impossible to understand the normative force with which people who talk about the merit-based process insist on it, right? Because the merit-based process is just a bunch of box ticking exercises. What you want is a country that's devoted to participation in the European Union, right? So then the question is how do you actually get that kind of devotion? Do you get it by putting people through a long training process, or do you get it by telling people how much you really want them to be part of this, and then explaining that once they're given this opportunity, they're going to have to work really hard in order to benefit as much as possible from the experience? I think that's two different ways of organizing membership. If you look at many organizations, the membership starts at the beginning and not the end. You join the military before you go through boot camp. You don't go through boot camp before you join the military, right? And so then the question is why do we have a membership structure in the European Union that puts all the heavy lifting before you join? And that's because we could afford that. We had lots of countries that wanted to join. We could dangle the prospect of membership. We could give them all these conditions that they had to meet. And at the end, if they met the conditions, they might be rewarded. That kind of arrangement is no longer appropriate. We don't want Ukraine to be a member if Ukraine meets the conditions. We want Ukraine to be a member to be safe and secure and prosperous. So why don't we just treat this like we treat the membership of a military or military organization or a security community? You give the membership first, and then you organize the merit-based approximation of whatever later. And in that case, there's nothing legally that prevents the European Union from doing this. Article 49 does not specify that the conditions laid out by the European Council and the Copenhagen criteria be met prior to joining. It just mentions that those conditions should someday be met, right? And it doesn't specify what membership means. It just says the country has to be European and it has to want to join. I think Ukraine meets both of those criteria. So let's get on with it and then figure out how best to make it happen.
Let's hope that the European leaders will listen to this episode and will follow this brilliant example of yours. Thank you. Erik, so to sum up, looking at everything we've discussed today, from internal EU capacity and strategic autonomy to Ukraine's accession to the EU, how can the European Union make enlargement a true win-win situation for both Europe and Ukraine? And what needs to be watched carefully in accession modalities to strengthen the EU while also supporting Ukraine's stability, reforms, and long-term security guarantees?
Okay, Marta, the question has so much in it. And let's just agree to agree that it would be great if Ukraine could approximate the acquis communautaire, that it could adopt the single currency, that it could integrate its financial markets and connect up its energy infrastructures and do all the things that we want a member state to accomplish. And we can easily imagine all the benefits that would accrue to the European Union. Think about the eastern reaches of Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and the northeastern corner of Romania, and how much those very underserved parts of the European Union would grow if Ukraine would grow, right? I mean, we would be enhancing the strength of Central and Eastern Europe dramatically. And if we extended this enlargement process to Moldova, to the Western Balkans, there are so many advantages that could be gained, right? So let's just take that as read. The bigger issue is institutions and decision making, right? This is not going to work if the European Union has an institutional setup where existing member states can extract rents or advantages from holding up the accession process or from holding up Ukraine's approximation of the acquis communautaire and its adoption of all the other principles and rules that are set out in the Copenhagen criteria. If individual member states can use these as instruments to prevent the rest of the European Union from achieving its goals, then nobody wins except these individual member states, and then they win so little compared to what they lose. You have to ask yourself what their political leadership is thinking in terms of the well-being of their own countries, right? And that's what we need to avoid. We need to avoid a situation where politicians in individual member states do self-harm to their own countries and to the European Union as a form of gamesmanship in the context of this accession process and after, when the accession is completed and the decision-making institutions have to be re-engineered to accommodate a larger membership and a more diverse membership. So those are the things that we need to think about. We need to think about the adaptation of the European Union to the challenge it faces. The adaptation of Ukraine, the adaptation of Moldova, the adaptation of the countries of the Western Balkans, we know that needs to take place. Nobody disagrees on that. Where we disagree is how much the European Union needs to adapt now in order for them successfully to adapt later. And that agreement needs to be reached, I would argue, in the next 6 months or a year at the latest.
Fingers crossed. There was Erik Jones, the director and professor at Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies, European University Institute. And now we move to our second speaker, Veronica Anghel, assistant professor at Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at European University Institute. Welcome, Veronica. So, Veronica, please share with us what were your thoughts when following the updates from this edition of the Munich Security Conference? And if we say that Munich reflects how Europe frames its strategic challenges, does that framing really match the risk landscape you identify in your recently published report on top global risks?
That's a very interesting question. I think that broadly, yes, the framing matches the risk landscape that we've been mapping at Robert Schuman Centre. I mean, it's not just one risk, but there are correlated risks. The Munich Security Report's core argument is that this idea of the wrecking ball politics and institutional erosion are reshaping the security environment, which maps neatly onto a risk logic where Europe's exposure is systemic, right? So in the Global Risk to the EU, the experts identify war plus hybrid disruption plus alliance volatility as converging risks. So I think that where Munich only partially matches our logic is that the speeches that we hear still compartmentalize risks, right? So you have Ukraine and Russia as threat in one lane, then you have China in tech in another, then you have domestic polarization or nationalism somewhere else, rather than treating these overlapping risks more like interdependent and cascading. And I think that this is something that probably it's still missing in the general conversation around security for the EU security architecture, where you can see security as governance across domains, more of a total defense type of framing rather than individual risks that need to be addressed with individual specific strategies.
Veronica, during the conference, we had the opportunity to observe quite visible disparities between Brussels and Washington's views on current global challenges and how to tackle them. And do you see continued support for Ukraine as a potential apple of discord between Europe and the United States, or on contrary, as an unifying glue that holds transatlantic relations together? And what risks, in your opinion, could tip the balance either way?
Well, I would say that Secretary of State Rubio's message stressed this idea of transatlantic belonging for Europe, but it came from this very specific ideological perspective that emphasized civilizational ties that come from a different age and don't really apply to what Europe identifies as its own strategies for the future right now, which is much more to overcome these sort of ideas of self-identification based on I don't know civilizational superiority and everything else that is the MAGA base in the United States. So I think that even if that message stressed transatlantic connections, it was also, out of tune with what Europeans are doing, and it's also light on concrete commitments, and even avoided directly centering Russia or NATO. Which for Europeans is the whole plot, right? So I think that this would affect Ukraine's support. And I don't know if Ukraine support can be either glue, but it can also be, let's say, a point of discord, because the tipping risks are pretty concrete. We already see a US political shift toward this idea of ending the war quickly, where peace pretty much means externalizing risk to Europe without a US concern. That's the first risk. Then perhaps European fatigue is another, if publics don't see a credible theory of victory and an idea of long run burden sharing. Again, this is all from a European perspective. The first actor that matters here and also in the negotiations is going to be Ukraine, and then of course Russia, who could stop this war at any time. And so this is it's very there are a lot of moving pieces, and I think that in the transatlantic relationship at this point, Ukraine is not really unifying the agendas. But it's not just because of Ukraine. I think that the transatlantic partners, the United States and Europe, are just very divergent on a number of important issues.
In which way do you think the US shift in policy vis-à-vis Russia might also influence this?
Well, clearly, the United States under the Trump administration has an interest to organize their connection to Russia in a more transactional, business-first way. Obviously, there's no morality or ethics or solidarity involved in any of this, but also it's very difficult to understand what exactly the United States is going to get out of a deep connection with Russia, because there isn't really much that, given the huge asymmetry between the two economies, the United States can get out of Russia. Of course, there are all these ideas about deals for rare earths or energy exchanges or business investments. It's very unlikely that anything can come from the third-rate economy that Russia has reduced itself to during their shift to a wartime economy, right? So I think that the relationship between the United States and Russia under the Trump administration is the greatest obstacle in this resecuring, or let's say rebalancing the security architecture of Europe. And of course, not to say that this is really making life and any outcome much worse for Ukrainians themselves.
It's also interesting, right, how the rhetoric shifted. So during the conference from the US side, there was no sole mention, the direct mention that who the real aggressor is, that is Russia. So, but rather blaming the EU. How do you think also this rhetoric might influence the current transatlantic relations?
Well, I think that first of all, when the blame for the start of the war lies squarely with Russia, I don't think that we keep saying that because there are people who still disinform the publics. It's important to repeat, but beyond that, there's always the issue that the Europeans have not done enough, or they have not seen the great threat that was Russia as quickly as they should have. They did not participate in anticipating the emergence of, let's say, this war by decoupling from Russia earlier on, so that Russia could feel less emboldened. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can blamed Europeans for not having done before the start of the war to be more deterrent when it comes to Russia's interest in Ukraine as well. And since the start of the full-scale invasion, to support Ukraine towards a clearer victory and not just survival. And also, of course, this constant focus on national politics as opposed to a more integrated EU-based strategy. That's another problem that the Europeans need to deal with. Of course, there isn't this is, again, not where the blame for the start of the war lies with the Europeans or with NATO or with Ukrainians, even less so, but the way that the war has progressed is a multitude of, let's say, converging weaknesses that yes, we can hold over the decision making of many Europeans.
The EU is currently trying to cope with multiple tasks to build its strategic autonomy by strengthening defense planning, improving financial coordination, and enhancing institutional capacity. And in your opinion, which of these tasks should carry the most weight to effectively respond to the war in Ukraine and Europe's broader security challenges? And do you see a strategic plan guiding how these priorities are balanced, or they are more ad hoc, spontaneous reactions?
So I think that if there's one strategic autonomy task that has to carry the most weight, that would be financial coordination for security mobilization. I think that's because it does multiple things at once. It unlocks procurement, industrial scaling, infrastructure hardening, investment in societal readiness, sustained Ukraine support. And it's not just about making Europeans more independent. Obviously, there is no other choice, and this was von der Leyen's Munich line. But it's also about subscribing all these apparently scattered decisions and mechanisms and financing schemes that the European Union is setting up under one strategic line. So I think it's right now the conversation is shifting beyond strategic autonomy and more towards a situation of what I call total defense, which is a position for the European Union that is not at war in conventional terms, but it's not at peace either. And what this means is that there is a political and economic and security mandate for the EU to coordinate, to have, let's say, better responses also to the gaps that exist for long-term security, prosperity, and credibility of the EU. So under this idea of financial coordination for security, I would say that EU obviously needs to invest in industrial depth and the production of military capabilities, but also in kind of like command and control, decentralized structures under one security logic, right? So they all have to come together, whether it's sanctions or export controls or investment screening, and finally, probably the most important part is the creation of a European we feeling that includes Ukraine and Moldovans. And this means societal and infrastructure resilience for resist disinformation, sabotage resistance, just cyber continuity, media literacy, all these issues that allow the society to respond to in a unified way to a potential catastrophe, let's say.
Coming back to the EU enlargement agenda, how do you think enlargement can be made truly transformative, especially in bringing EU standards to Ukraine even while the war is still ongoing? What scenarios do you think are most likely to happen?
So I think at this point, it's becoming clear that everyone agrees that enlargement has to happen at a fast pace. It's just that not everybody agrees how to pay for it and what is the exact schedule for that fast-paced enlargement. So I think that to make enlargement transformative at this point, the logic is to front-load standards through staged integration or phased integration, right? So what we want to call it, or the reverse enlargement that is now presented as an option, to have as much sectoral single market access where it matters for Ukraine, that can help with procurement, competition, customs, different standards. Then really an EU oversight capacity that is embedded in Ukrainian institutions, but also some reversible conditionality that is tied to funding and market privileges. And I think that this is increasingly part of the security conversation around Ukraine. The most likely scenarios now, and particularly on these ideas for fast tracking Ukraine towards a 2027 reverse enlargement that circulated prominently around Munich. I think that this is, it's possible, but it's a variation on the same theme of phased accession. There are many nuances, but the scenarios are this, right? So the phased or staged accession, with hard sectoral milestones, and those milestones need to be credible, and only, I mean, if the rewards are real, but also for the European public, I think they also have to have kind of like snapback mechanisms that give the idea of reversibility. I think that, yeah, it's important to have acceleration politically with wartime conditionality, so heavier monitoring from the EU, technical assistance, clearer consequences for backsliding. Yeah, this is all happening in many ways, and I think that the EU has proven how flexible it is when it comes to its interests. So enlargement is important, and the EU it's really moving forward, I think, in very creative ways.
Thank you, Veronica, for your forecast. Let's hope indeed that Ukraine will be able to join the European Union in 2027. We all wait for this moment very much. And thank you once again to our distinguished guests, Erik Jones and Veronica Anghel, for the insightful discussion on the key takeaways from Munich Security Conference. Stay tuned for more episodes from Advanced EU EUA.